Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation and I join you this morning with a deep sense of satisfaction. November 2012 saw Sri Lanka face its second UPR, and we were able to lay before the working group our progress since 2008 and the expectations for future improvements in the promotion and protection of human rights. Going forward, we have come a long way since the initial Universal Periodic Review of Sri Lanka during the first cycle in 2008. My country then was engaged in a conflict against terrorism, commencing in 2006, trying to rescue a civilian population held by a ruthless group of terrorists. A year after that first review, we finally achieved success in the humanitarian operation and witnessed the dawn of a new era of peace, stability, and prosperity for all Sri Lankans. Since May 2009, we engaged in a period of consolidation, removing military involvement in civil administration, reconstruction, demining, rehabilitation, resettlement, and launched our initial efforts at national reconciliation and peace building. I must point out that Sri Lanka has accepted the 12 recommendations specifically referring to the National Action Plan for the implementation of the recommendations of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, which is our mechanism to implement the recommendations of the LLRC. It is perhaps unfortunate that we were unable to agree to more refinements and modifications in the text of some recommendations in order to achieve a consensus that could have led to the acceptance of more recommendations. It is our belief, Mr. President, that the level of flexibility that characterized our experience in 2008, the first cycle, is preferable to the rigid textual formality that appears to govern the UPR at present. The UPR is an intergovernmental process that is based on cooperation and constructive engagement. The government of Sri Lanka has also made requisite financial provision by budgetary allocation for 2013 for the implementation of the National Action Plan on the implementation of the recommendations of the LLRC. Over rupees 1.2 billion has been committed to funding the various activities. Our progress in the process of implementation is openly shared with anyone interested by way of publication on the web. This is the level of commitment we have shown. In the overall process of accountability, which was the subject of some interventions during the working group session, the first issue that must be addressed is that of the arbitrary figures of the so-called civilian victims. These figures have been repeated by several sources without once verifying the facts. This is why our national census of 2012 and the enumeration in the north preceding it in 2011 were of such importance. Ground verification of facts is continuing as we speak, and results of these processes will be identified. We believe we will be able to gain an accurate picture of the several causes of civilian deaths. Subsequent to the recommendations of the LLRC, the Attorney General reviewed the cases relating to the 5 students from Trincomalee. I'm still on accountability. 5 students from Trincomalee and the ACF workers. Having concluded the work on the 5 students from Trincomalee, the Attorney General has directed the police to commence non-summary judicial proceedings. The review with regard to the ACF case is also ongoing. Needless to say, Mr. President, we will of course keep our friends in the international community updated on the progress. Also on the question of accountability, inquiries are in train by the military authorities as to questions of civilian casualties during the humanitarian operation, including the Channel 4 video footage, irrespective of its authenticity. I reiterate what I said earlier, that Sri Lanka is deeply appreciative of member and observer states for their interest and positive engagement during the UPR process, as well as the acknowledgement of our efforts in the promotion and protection of human rights. As with the UPR, Sri Lanka will continue its transparent, proactive and constructive engagement with the Human Rights Council and keep member and observer states informed of further developments in Sri Lanka in the field of promotion and protection of human rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, I look forward to the engagement during the ensuing hour and expect a positive outcome that will accrue to the benefit of the multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious and multicultural people of Sri Lanka. I thank you for your attention.
Sri Lanka to the Council and appreciates the opportunity to comment on their responses to the UPR review. We welcome the government's statement of its intention to accept recommendations to combat gender-based violence, to carry out an independent and credible investigation into the allegations of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and to strengthen the independence of institutions, including the Human Rights Commission, Police Commission, and Election Commission. During the review, a number of states called for the implementation of the recommendations of Sri Lanka's own Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. We are disappointed that the government rejected all UPR recommendations from states that called upon it to implement the LLRC recommendations. Further, the Sri Lankan delegation attempted to reframe Sri Lanka's human rights commitments in terms of the government's National Action Plan, which does not address the broad spectrum of recommendations put forward by the LLRC, and by lobbying other delegations to revise their UPR recommendations to exclude reference to the LLRC report after they had initially been orally presented. Major changes were made to the substance of the recommendations after the interactive dialogue, which is inconsistent with the transparent, interactive character of the UPR. We are also disappointed that the government rejected nearly all recommendations regarding engagement and cooperation with UN Special Procedures mandate holders. We urge the government to expeditiously implement both the UPR and LLRC recommendations.
Lanka's response to recommendations following their UPR. We welcome Sri Lanka's acceptance of the UK's recommendation to fully and transparently investigate alleged grave breaches of international humanitarian law during the conflict. The UK hopes to see the fulfilment of this as soon as possible, given the lack of transparency in procedures to date. However, we have serious concerns about freedom of expression in Sri Lanka, given recent attacks on a number of journalists. We note that the rejection of the UK's recommendation to ensure that, quote, all citizens are able to freely express their opinions and beliefs without fear of reprisal or retribution, and to invite the Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression to visit, end quote, requires further explanation from Sri Lanka. Given Sri Lanka's statement that it stands ready to facilitate the visit of the High Commission of Human Rights to Sri Lanka, and that human rights defenders enjoy every protection of their rights, the UK fails to see why the government of Sri Lanka cannot accept this recommendation in full. Finally, Mr. President, we are also concerned that no justification has been given for the rejection of recommendations relating to the independence of the judiciary. The impeachment of the Chief Justice ran contrary to the clear rulings of Sri Lanka's highest courts, and the proceedings appear to contravene principles of fairness, due process, and respect for the independence of the judiciary. Thank you, Mr. President.
The delegation of Sri Lanka and His Excellency Mr. Samarasinghe, the head of delegation, for their participation in the report adoption process under the UPR process. Sri Lanka's second UPR cycle has once again confirmed Colombo's openness and readiness to engage in a constructive dialogue on an equal footing on the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Sri Lanka has agreed with the majority of the recommendations made. The recommendations accepted are truly constructive and non-politicized in nature. We thank the delegation for its detailed arguments explaining why each of the non-accepted recommendations has not been accepted, and we are satisfied to note that some of these recommendations may be looked at by the authorities of the country with a view to subsequent implementation following detailed study. In addition, we much appreciate the government's list of voluntary commitments on many aspects of human rights. The Russian Federation recommends the adoption of the report on Sri Lanka's second UPR cycle. Thank you.
The delegation would like to thank the Sri Lankan delegation for its positive responses to the recommendations on its UPR report. China appreciates Sri Lanka's important achievements in advancing domestic reconciliation and promoting economic social development. China calls on the international community to respect the sovereignty of Sri Lanka, to objectively look at its enormous efforts in advancing domestic reconciliation and protecting human rights, to provide constructive assistance to Sri Lanka, and to avoid interfering in its domestic affairs. We are convinced that with the common efforts of its government and people, Sri Lanka will continue making new progress in the fields of economic social development as well as human rights. China supports the Council's approval of the report of Sri Lanka. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. During its UPR, Sri Lanka rejected nearly half of the recommendations proposed by member states. Among the rejected recommendations were those to implement the recommendations of the government's own Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. Instead, the government committed only to implement its National Action Plan on the LLRC, which itself ignores nearly 50% of the LLRC recommendations. The LLRC recommendations were already severely limited in scope. In its resolution, the Human Rights Council noted with concern that the LLRC report does not adequately address serious allegations of violations of international law. By restricting its focus to the National Action Plan on the LLRC, the Sri Lankan government indicated that it is even unwilling to accept and implement recommendations by its own bodies. In addition, as further evidence of its lack of commitment on accountability, the government turned down basic recommendations focusing on the need to end impunity and investigate serious allegations of human rights violations. For instance, the government rejected Thailand's recommendation to strengthen relevant legislative and administrative measures to ensure transparency and non-impunity in the judicial process. In his presentation, Minister Samarasinghe forgot to mention that on February 15, the Army Court of Inquiry, set up to look into allegations of war crimes during the war, exonerated the Army of any liability for civilian casualties. This puts to rest any remaining hope that the domestic process will adequately respond to such allegations. It is also of serious concern that the government of Sri Lanka rejected all the recommendations that were made during the UPR regarding the need to protect human rights defenders and their work. Sri Lanka has a dismal track record on this issue. Since the March 2012 resolution was passed, civil society and media in Sri Lanka who are critical of the government or support accountability have come under attack. Thank you, Mr. President.
My name is Dr. Kasipula Manoharan. On 2nd of January 2006, the Sri Lanka soldiers brutally murdered my beloved son Rajihar. On beach, Ringamale, my family is forcibly leave to Sri Lanka because I sought the justice of my killing, of his killing. Today, the 7 long years away the past, seeing my son's murder without any justice and decisions from Sri Lanka courts. It's 2011, the national report for the UPR government in Sri Lanka informed to the council that the case is my son and his 4 friends who were also murdered was sent to the Attorney General to determine was case is lesser in procession. Attorney General advised to the IGP continue these cases further investigation till it's not for time. I have as very sorry I can't continue this thing, Mr. President. With the pressure, pain, I lost my son, Rajihar. I seek to you help and the Human Rights Council move this investigation for the murder these 5 youth men to the international level, because I have not hope for the justice in Sri Lanka. Thank you, President.
Who spoke regarding the death of his loved one. We stand with him in his grief and in his search for justice. Mr. President, Jubilee Campaign, together with Christian Solidarity Worldwide, expresses grave concern that the period since the end of the war in Sri Lanka has been marked by state-sponsored Sinhala Buddhist triumphalism, the weakening of democratic institutions and rule of law, the constriction of civil and political rights, abductions and forcible disappearances, and a widespread climate of fear among human rights defenders and journalists. Moreover, there has been a deterioration with regard to the right to freedom of religion or belief. The 2000 attack on a mosque in Dambulla by a mob led by extremist Buddhist monks has reignited concern about targeted violence against religious minorities in Sri Lanka. Incidents of violence against Christian churches, after declining in number for nearly 10 years, are once again rising. Recent rhetoric and attacks by the Bordu Balasina, which is acting aggressively and with apparent impunity, give rise to fresh concerns. There are increasing restrictions on peaceful and legitimate religious activities. The construction of religious buildings and conduct of religious activities is subject to non-legislative circulars from 2008 and 2012, issued by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. They grant discretionary authority to local officials to determine on an arbitrary basis the legitimacy of religious activities, and are implemented in a manner which is discriminatory against evangelical churches. An increasing number of churches are being closed down by local officials. Mr. President, we urge Sri Lanka to issue a standing invitation to all special procedures mandates, including to accept all outstanding visit requests. Sri Lanka must put an end to all abductions and forcible disappearances. Finally, Sri Lanka should ensure that the process of promoting national reconciliation takes into account the need to protect Sri Lanka's ethnic and religious pluralism and put an end to rising violence against religious minorities. Thank you.
Sri Lanka's first UPR in 2008 began shortly before the height of the armed conflict, a period in which a UN panel of experts report found credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. An estimated 70,000 Tamil civilians are believed to have been killed in a matter of months during this time period, primarily attributed to the actions of the Sri Lankan military. Nearly 4 years later, giving the government of Sri Lanka time and space for domestic processes has failed to advance peace or reconciliation in the traditionally Tamil north and east of Sri Lanka. Concerned with the deteriorating state of human rights in Sri Lanka, member states made concrete, constructive recommendations during the UPR process. Sri Lanka's response was extraordinarily belligerent in rejecting nearly half of the recommendations made, 94 out of 204 recommendations. Sri Lanka's refusal to adopt the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, and accede to the Rome Statute of the ICC, recommended by 18 states, speaks louder than the government's rhetoric on addressing issues of torture, disappearances, or violations of international law through its domestic efforts. Evidence has recently surfaced indicating that Sri Lankan forces executed a 12-year-old boy in cold blood for no crime but for being born the son of the Tamil rebel leader. Just last week, buses with over 900 Tamil civilians from the north were forcibly prevented from attending a demonstration in Colombo to protest the enforced disappearance of their relatives. Given the existence of credible allegations of war crimes, coupled with Sri Lanka's demonstrated unwillingness and inability to investigate itself, we ask the Council to establish an independent International Commission of Inquiry for Sri Lanka. An International Commission of Inquiry could act as a guardrail against the continued broken promises made by the Sri Lankan government to its citizens and the international community and pave the way towards genuine reconciliation. Thank you, Mr. President.
May I, at the outset, thank everyone who participated in the working group, especially for the constructive engagement that was shown on the UPR of Sri Lanka. I can remember sitting here and listening to many interventions, and I must say for the record that a clear majority of those interventions did appreciate and acknowledge the tremendous progress that has been made by the government of Sri Lanka in moving towards comprehensive reconciliation. One must not forget that this is a 30-year conflict, almost 30-year conflict, facing one of the worst forms of terrorism that the world had ever seen that was brought to an end. Many thousands of people suffered over the years. I listened to some of the interventions by the non-governmental organizations who took the floor, but I didn't hear anyone talking about the extreme atrocities that were committed by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. I would like to share some of these instances with all those who are listening today on the UPR of Sri Lanka. During this period of 30 years, many civilians were brutally murdered and assassinated by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Suicide bombers, bombs in buses, killed men, women, children in their thousands. When 186 Muslim citizens of Sri Lanka were praying in a mosque in Katankudi, they were indiscriminately killed by the LTT who came into the mosque, didn't identify who the people in the mosque were. They just shot at them and they killed them in cold blood. There were thousands of Muslims who were banished forcibly from Jaffna, from Mana, from a place called Muttur. I myself, when I was the Minister for Disaster Management during that time, I can remember going to some of these IDP camps and seeing thousands and thousands of Muslims, for no fault of their own, who were banished forcibly from their homes by the LTT. Buddhist places of worship were targeted. The holiest shrine for the Buddhists, called the Temple of the Tooth, which is a historical place of worship for all Buddhists all over the world, was targeted with the intention of creating a backlash amongst the Sinhalese against the Tamils. Fortunately, the Sinhalese did not react, because we had learned a lesson from 1983 when there was a backlash, and it was never, fortunately, repeated again. Now, all these instances, I can tell you hundreds and hundreds of such instances where men, women, children, I can show you photographs of little babies who were mutilated as a result of the LTT's indiscriminate attention to wipe out anyone who was blocking their autocratic, brutal way of destabilizing the country and resorting to extreme forms of terrorism during this period. Now, anyone who talks about instances of killings, instances of these kinds of very important instances should also be balanced. Why didn't anyone talk about the atrocities of the LTT? This is why we resolved that we wanted to wipe out the LTT and give the freedom that is now given to all people of Sri Lanka. We are a multicultural society, we are a multi-religious society, we are a multi-ethnic society. Religious belief is guaranteed by the Constitution of Sri Lanka. There may be instances where religious places of worship have been attacked in the past during these 30 years, but after the end of the conflict, these instances have been significantly diminished. And our government does not condone any such instance of attack of religious places of worship, because we have given guarantees under the Constitution for religious freedom to our people, and we will continue to protect and nurture that freedom that we have given. So please be balanced. You can certainly bring to our attention outstanding cases, and as I mentioned in my initial speech, the 5 Trincomalee students, the case has now commenced, and there is a non-summary trial. That is a judicial inquiry that is proceeding as we speak. We need the time and space to look at these instances. We have not set it aside. We have not absolved ourselves from the responsibility that is ours. We want to ensure sustainable peace in Sri Lanka, and as much as these instances will be looked at and those who are responsible for these gruesome events are dealt with within the framework of the law, we will ensure that those instances which took place during the last 30 years would also be looked into and comprehensive reconciliation achieved in our journey towards ensuring sustainable peace. We have never come here to this council and said that everything is fine in Sri Lanka. We have put on record the progress that has been made. We have also acknowledged very clearly that there are challenges ahead of us. We are only asking for time and space to overcome these challenges. Within 3.5 years, considerable progress has been made, and we have put that on record. No one can challenge that. Of course, there are other challenges which needs to be overcome, and we have resolved that we will ensure that these challenges are also overcome. We have never absolved ourselves from the responsibility of placing before the international community all the progress that has been done in relation to moving towards comprehensive reconciliation, and we will continue to do that. We want to engage with you, but what we ask you is to be balanced, to be objective, to be impartial. As much as there is progress that needs to be acknowledged, it is important that time and space is given for further progress to be achieved. So having said that, Mr. President, I thank you very much for giving me the time to put everything in the correct perspective and assure everyone in this council that we will continue to engage with our friends in the international community, and we will continue to work towards further progress in Sri Lanka, moving towards comprehensive reconciliation. Thank you very much.